The storm hit faster than weather reports had predicted, turning what should have been a routine botanical survey into a fight for survival. Nia Rivers pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient pine, her research equipment scattered. Somewhere behind her in the chaos of wind and driving snow, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and her GPS device showed nothing but static where her rescue coordinates should have been. She had always prided herself on being prepared for wilderness emergencies. Her backpack contained enough supplies for 3 days. Her boots were rated for subarctic conditions, and she knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. But nature had its own schedule, and right now it seemed determined to remind her exactly who was in charge of this remote corner of Alaska. The wind howled through the trees with a voice that sounded almost alive, almost angry. Nia pulled her hood tighter and squinted through the swirling white, looking for any sign of shelter. Her team would be looking for her, she knew that much. But in conditions like these, even the most experienced search and rescue crews would have to wait for the storm to pass. A flash of darkwood caught her eye through the snow. About 50 yards ahead, barely visible through the storm, stood what looked like a small cabin, abandoned by the look of it, with windows dark and no smoke rising from the chimney. But it represented her best hope of surviving the night. The trek to the cabin felt like miles. Instead of yards, each step sank deep into snow that hadn't been there that morning, and the wind seemed determined to push her back toward the trees. By the time she reached the wooden steps, her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and her face felt raw from the cold. The door was unlocked, swinging open with a creak that spoke of long neglect. Inside, the cabin was simple but solid. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with enough splitwood stacked beside it to keep her warm through the night. A small table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, while a narrow bed with a faded quilt sat against the far wall. Nia dropped her pack and immediately set about building a fire. Within minutes, orange flames were dancing in the hearth, casting warm light across the cabin's interior and beginning to chase away the bone-deep cold that had settled into her body. She arranged her wet clothes on the chairs to dry and pulled out her emergency supplies: dried fruit, energy bars, and a thermos of coffee that was still barely warm. As the storm continued to rage outside, she found herself thinking about her research. She had come to these mountains to study the adaptation patterns of alpine wildflowers, documenting how they survived in harsh conditions. There was something poetic about finding herself in a similar situation, using her own adaptation skills to weather an unexpected crisis. The coffee was gone, and she was considering whether to ration her food for a second day, when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze despite the warmth from the fire. Low, haunting, and unmistakably wild. Wolves were howling somewhere very close to the cabin. Nia moved to the window and peered out into the storm. At first she saw nothing but swirling snow and the dark shapes of trees bending in the wind. Then, like ghosts materializing from the white, she saw them, yellow eyes glowing in the reflection of her firelight. 5 of them, maybe 6, ranged in a loose semicircle round the cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she backed away from the window. Every survival manual she had ever read said the same thing about wolf encounters: make yourself large, make noise, never show fear, never run. But those manuals assumed you could leave the situation. Trapped in a cabin with a pack of wolves outside, her options were considerably more limited. The howling came again, closer this time, multiple voices joining in a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. Nia found herself pressing against the far wall of the cabin, as if the extra few feet might make a difference if they decided to break down the door. But as the minutes passed and no attack came, she began to notice something strange. The howls weren't aggressive. They carried a different tone entirely, something almost conversational. And the wolves weren't trying to get in. They were simply there, present in the storm. As if keeping watch, curiosity began to override fear as she crept back to the window. The pack had moved closer, close enough that she could see them clearly despite the snow. They were magnificent creatures, larger than she had expected, with thick winter coats that made them seem almost mythical in the firelight. The largest, A female with silver-tipped fur and intelligent amber eyes sat directly in front of the cabin door. She wasn't snarling or showing teeth. She was simply watching, almost without thinking. Naya found herself speaking to the wolf through the glass. "I know this is your territory," she said softly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just trying to stay warm until the storm passes." The alpha female tilted her head at the sound of her voice. Ears pricked forward in an expression that looked remarkably like curiosity. The other pack members shifted slightly, but none showed signs of aggression. If anything, they seemed to be settling in for a long wait. Hours passed in this strange standoff. Naya kept the fire burning and occasionally moved to the window to check on her unexpected guardians. They remained in position, taking turns moving through the snow, but always maintaining their protective circle around the cabin. When she spoke to them again, telling them about her work with flowers and how she'd gotten lost, the alpha female's ears would perk up as if she understood every word. Near midnight, exhaustion finally overcame adrenaline. Naya wrapped herself in the cabin's quilt and settled into the narrow bed, one eye still on the window. The wolf pack had grown quiet, but she could see their dark shapes moving like shadows in the firelight as sleep claimed her. She realized something extraordinary was happening. These wolves, these apex predators that should have seen her as either threat or prey, had instead chosen to become her protectors. They were keeping watch through the storm, ensuring that nothing else would threaten the small human who had stumbled into their domain. When she woke the next morning, to sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows, the storm had passed. The world outside was transformed into a pristine wonderland of fresh snow and crystal-clear air. And there, still arranged in their protective formation around the cabin, were her wolves. They looked up as she appeared in the doorway, their amber eyes reflecting intelligence and something that almost looked like affection. The alpha female stood and approached slowly, stopping just beyond arm's reach. For a long moment, woman and wolf regarded each other in the morning light. "Thank you," Naya whispered, and she could have sworn she saw understanding in those ancient golden eyes. The sound of distant helicopter rotors began to echo through the mountains. Her rescue was coming, and soon this magical interlude would end. But as the wolves melted back into the forest, the alpha female paused at the tree line for one last look. Naya knew her life had just changed forever. Marcus Stone had been tracking the Midnight Pack for 3 months, following them through some of the most remote wilderness in Alaska with nothing but his cameras, his instincts, and a determination that bordered on obsession. As a wildlife photographer, he had documented everything from African lions to Arctic foxes. But wolves had always been his passion. There was something about their social dynamics, their intelligence, their fierce loyalty to family that spoke to something deep in his soul. He had named them after watching their behaviors for weeks. Luna, the silver-tipped alpha female with eyes like molten amber. Shadow, her mate, a massive black wolf with a white patch on his chest. Storm, their adolescent son who was all legs and curiosity. Whisper, the pack's scout, gray as morning mist and twice as elusive. And finally, the twins, Frost and Fire, yearlings who couldn't have been more different despite sharing the same litter. Marcus knew their hunting patterns, their territory boundaries, their favorite denning sites. He knew that Luna was pregnant again and that the pack was preparing for new rivals. He knew that Storm was challenging his father's authority in small ways, testing the boundaries of adolescent rebellion. He knew them better than he knew most humans, which was why their behavior over the past 18 hours had him completely baffled. The storm had blown in fast, forcing Marcus to take shelter in a grove of thick pines about 2 miles from where he'd last seen the pack. He'd waited it out with professional patience, knowing that wolves were more active after storms when prey animals came out to forage. What he hadn't expected was to track them to an abandoned cabin, where they seemed to have appointed themselves as guardians. Now, crouched behind a fallen log with his telephoto lens, trained on the scene, Marcus watched in amazement as Luna approached the cabin door. Through his viewfinder, he could see a young woman with dark hair framed in the doorway. She was speaking to the wolf, actually speaking to her, and Luna was listening with the focused attention she usually reserved for pack communications. Marcus had been photographing wildlife for 15 years. He had seen remarkable things, impossible things, moments that defied every textbook and field guide ever written. But this surpassed all of them: a human and a wild wolf pack, coexisting not just peacefully but protectively. The wolves weren't tolerating this woman's presence. They were actively guarding her. He adjusted his camera settings, capturing frame after frame as the woman stepped out of the cabin. She moved slowly, deliberately, showing none of the fear or aggression that would normally characterize such an encounter. When she knelt down and extended her hand toward Luna, Marcus held his breath. Luna sniffed the offered hand, then sat back on her haunches in a gesture that was unmistakably accepting. The other pack members began to emerge from their positions, forming a loose circle around the woman. Storm, the adolescent, actually approached close enough to allow her to touch his fur. Through his lens, Marcus watched the woman's face transform. Wonder replaced caution, joy replaced fear. She was experiencing something that perhaps no human had ever experienced before: true acceptance by a wild wolf pack, and the wolves themselves seemed equally entranced by this strange, gentle creature who had appeared in their territory. Marcus found himself thinking about his ex-wife Elena. She would never believe this, not even with photographic evidence. Elena was practical, scientific, bound by protocols and regulations. As a park ranger, she saw the wilderness through the lens of safety management and risk assessment. She would look at these photos and see a dangerous situation that needed immediate intervention. But Marcus saw something else entirely. He saw the possibility of connection across species lines. He saw evidence that the bonds between humans and animals could transcend the artificial boundaries that civilization had created. He saw hope for a world where coexistence was possible. The helicopter arrived just after noon, its rotors cutting through the crisp mountain air with mechanical precision. Marcus watched through his telephoto as the search and rescue team prepared to descend. The wolves heard it too, their ears pricking up in alert attention. But instead of fleeing, they moved closer to the woman, as if preparing to protect her from this new threat. Luna positioned herself directly between the woman and the approaching aircraft, her body language shifting into protective mode. The other pack members flanked her, creating a living barrier. Marcus had never seen anything like it. Wild wolves defending a human from other humans. The woman seemed to understand what was happening. She knelt beside Luna, placing one hand on the wolf's silver fur while gesturing toward the helicopter with the other. She was speaking again, and though Marcus couldn't hear her words over the rotor noise, he could see the calming effect they had on the pack. Slowly, reluctantly, the wolves began to withdraw toward the tree line, but they didn't go far. Marcus could see them through his lens, maintaining visual contact with their human charge as the rescue team approached the cabin. The lead rescuer was Elena. Marcus recognized her efficient movements, her no-nonsense approach to emergency situations. She was doing what she did best, taking charge, assessing threats, securing the scene. But she couldn't see what Marcus could see through his telephoto lens. She couldn't see Luna watching from the forest edge, or the way the entire pack remained on high alert, ready to intervene if their human needed protection. Elena was speaking to the woman now, probably asking about injuries, exposure, trauma, standard search and rescue protocol. The woman was responding, gesturing toward the forest, trying to explain what had happened. Marcus could see Elena's skepticism in her body language, the way she kept glancing toward the trees with professional wariness. As the rescue team prepared to evacuate the woman, something extraordinary happened. Luna stepped out of the forest, revealing herself at the edge of the clearing. She wasn't approaching, wasn't threatening, just making her presence known. The other pack members followed her lead, arranging themselves in a line among the trees. They were saying goodbye. The woman broke away from the rescue team and walked toward the wolves, stopping just beyond the tree line. Luna approached to meet her, and for a long moment, woman and wolf stood facing each other in perfect stillness. Then the woman reached out and placed both hands on Luna's head, leaning forward to rest her forehead against the wolf's. Marcus captured it all through his lens, knowing he was documenting something that would change everything. This wasn't just an unusual wildlife encounter. It was proof that the bonds between species could transcend every boundary that humans thought existed. When the woman finally turned away and walked back to the helicopter, Luna let out a single, long howl. The sound echoed across the mountains, and Marcus felt it resonate in his chest like a physical force. It was a sound of loss, of longing, of promises made across species lines as the helicopter lifted off, carrying the woman away from the wolves who had claimed her as family. Marcus continued shooting. He captured the pack's vigil at the tree line, their heads turned skyward, watching until the aircraft disappeared beyond the peaks. Then they were gone, melting back into the forest like spirits returning to their realm. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end of the story. He had 3 months' worth of behavioral documentation on this pack, plus today's unprecedented evidence of human-wolf bonding. He had a story that would revolutionize understanding of wildlife behavior. More importantly, he had Elena's contact information, and whether she liked it or not, she was about to become part of something extraordinary. Marcus packed his equipment and began the long hike back to his base camp, his mind already racing with possibilities. The woman, Naya. He'd heard Elena call her, had experienced something miraculous, but the wolves had experienced it too, and Marcus suspected they weren't ready to let their human family member disappear from their lives. This was just the beginning. Luna had lived through 7 winters in these mountains, and in all that time, she had never encountered anything quite like the small human who had appeared in their territory. During the great storm, the alpha female stood at the edge of the forest, watching the metal bird carry away the strange, gentle creature who had somehow become pack. The concept should have been impossible. Humans were danger, had always been danger. They carried fire sticks that could kill from far away. They moved in loud groups with machines that scared prey. They left scents that burned the nose and sounds that hurt the ears. Luna's own mother had died from human bullets when Luna was barely more than a pup, teaching her early that the 2-legged ones were to be avoided, feared, driven away when they encroached too far into pack territory. But this human had been different. From the first moment Luna caught her scent on the wind, it had been during the storm's peak when Luna first detected the unusual smell, near the old human den. Not the harsh, chemical odor that usually accompanied the 2-legged ones, but something softer. Fear, yes, but also something Luna recognized from her own pups when they were confused and seeking comfort. The human smelled lost, vulnerable, but not threatening. Shadow, her mate, had wanted to investigate immediately with teeth bared and hackles raised. The human was in their territory, near their denning grounds. During the season when Luna carried new life within her, every instinct screamed that this was a threat to be eliminated quickly and decisively. But Luna had sensed something else in that scent, something that made her pause and truly listen to what the wind was telling her. The human wasn't hunting, wasn't seeking to claim territory or steal resources. She was simply trying to survive, just as any creature would during such a storm. So Luna had made a choice that went against everything her kind had learned about humans. Instead of attack, she chose observation. Instead of driving the intruder away, she chose to watch and learn. The pack had followed her lead. Though Storm, her adolescent son, had questioned the decision with low whines and restless pacing, Whisper, ever the cautious scout, had wanted to maintain much greater distance. Even the twins, Frost and Fire, had seemed uncertain about approaching so close to a human den. But Luna had felt something stirring in her that was deeper than learned behavior, older than the inherited fear of humans. It was the same instinct that had made her adopt an orphaned fox kit 2 winters ago, the same protective drive that had once led her to defend an injured hawk from other predators. Sometimes the heart knew things that the mind couldn't understand. Through the long night of the storm, Luna had watched the human through the den's transparent barriers. The small female moved with careful efficiency, building fire for warmth, organizing her resources, settling in to wait out the storm's fury. She showed no signs of the aggressive territorial behavior that Luna had come to expect from humans. No loud vocalizations, no threatening gestures, no attempts to expand her claim beyond the immediate shelter. Most remarkably, when the human had seen the pack watching her, she hadn't responded with fear or aggression. Instead, she had done something that shocked Luna to her core. She had spoken to them. Not the harsh, commanding sounds that humans usually made, but soft vocalizations that carried tones of respect, even friendliness. "I know this is your territory," the human had said. And somehow Luna had understood not just the intent, but the meaning. The human was acknowledging pack sovereignty, asking permission rather than demanding space. It was in that moment that Luna made a decision that would have seemed impossible to any wolf who hadn't lived it. She chose to accept this strange creature. As temporary pack, the other wolves had looked to her for guidance, reading her body language and sent markers for direction. When Luna settled into a protective position near the den, they followed her lead. When she indicated that the human was under pack protection, they arranged themselves accordingly. Shadow had been the most skeptical, his dark eyes constantly scanning for signs of deception or hidden threat. But even he had gradually relaxed. As the night wore on, and the human continued to demonstrate no aggressive intent, by morning, he was actually helping to maintain the protective perimeter. The twins had been fascinated by this new pack member. Frost, always the more curious of the two, had crept closer to the den throughout the night, studying the human's movements and vocalizations. Fire, more cautious by nature, had maintained distance but watched with intense interest. Whisper had appointed herself as liaison, positioning herself where she could observe both the human and the surrounding territory for potential threats. Her role as pack scout extended naturally to guarding this unusual new family member. But it was Storm who had surprised Luna the most, her adolescent son. In the midst of testing every boundary and challenging every decision, had accepted the human's pack status without question. When morning came and the human emerged from the den, Storm had been the first to approach close enough for physical contact. Luna had watched with amazement as her son, usually so wary of anything unfamiliar, had allowed the human to touch his fur. The trust in that gesture had been absolute, the kind of acceptance that couldn't be forced or faked. Storm's instincts, unclouded by learned fear, had recognized something in this human that even Luna was still trying to understand. When the human had knelt and extended her hand, Luna had made her final, irrevocable choice. She had approached and accepted the offered contact, marking the human with pack scent and officially recognizing her as family. The sensation had been unlike anything Luna had ever experienced. Through the physical touch, she had felt the human's emotional state: wonder, joy, gratitude, and underneath it all, a deep loneliness that resonated with something in Luna's own spirit. This human was pack-minded but packless, a social creature who had been living in isolation. In that moment of contact, Luna had understood that this wasn't just about offering temporary protection to a Storm refugee. This was about recognizing a kindred spirit, someone who understood the bonds of loyalty and family that made pack life possible. The metal bird's arrival had triggered every protective instinct Luna possessed. The loud, mechanical sounds and strange scents had immediately been classified as potential threats to the newest pack member. Luna had positioned herself and the others in defensive formation, ready to fight if necessary to protect their human. But the small female had communicated her acceptance of the newcomers, using body language and vocalizations that Luna could read clearly. The human was choosing to leave with her own kind, not being taken against her will. Luna had to respect that choice, even though every fiber of her being wanted to defend this precious new family member. The goodbye had been the hardest part. When the human had approached the tree line for one final contact, Luna had felt the same wrenching sensation she experienced when her grown pups left to find their own territories. The human's forehead pressed against her own had carried sense of sadness and promise, of endings and beginnings. Luna's howl as the metal bird carried away their human had come from the deepest part of her soul. It was a sound of mourning for the loss, but also of calling, a promise that the pack bond transcended physical distance. That family was forever regardless of species. Now, standing in the forest as the sound of the metal bird faded beyond the mountains, Luna made one final decision. This separation wasn't permanent. The human carried pack scent now, was marked as family in ways that distance couldn't erase. and Luna would be watching, waiting, ready to provide protection whenever their lost pack member needed it. The other wolves gathered around their alpha, seeking guidance for what came next. Luna lifted her muzzle to the wind, already picking up the faint trail that would lead them toward wherever the metal bird had gone. Their pack was incomplete now, and Luna intended to do something about that. The hunt for their human family member was about to begin. Elena Winters had conducted over 100 search and rescue operations in her 8 years as a park ranger, and she prided herself on maintaining professional objectivity regardless of the circumstances. Whether extracting injured hikers from canyon walls or tracking lost campers through blizzards, she approached every situation with the same methodical precision that had made her one of the most respected rangers in the Alaska wilderness system. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what she found at the cabin on Sentinel Ridge. The call had come in at dawn from the botanical research team reporting their missing colleague. Standard protocol for someone separated during a storm meant waiting for weather clearance, then deploying search teams in grid patterns based on last known location and probable movement vectors. Elena had run the calculations herself. 26-year-old, female, experienced outdoors person, decent equipment, good physical condition. Survival odds were favorable if she'd found adequate shelter. What the calculations hadn't accounted for was finding that shelter guarded by a pack of wolves. Elena spotted them through her binoculars as the helicopter approached the cabin. 6 wolves ranged in a defensive formation around the building, their body language unmistakably protective rather than predatory. Her pilot, Jake Morrison, had over 15 years of wilderness flying experience, but even he did a double take when he saw the scene below. "That's not normal behavior," Jake said through the headset, his voice tight with concern. "Wolves don't guard human structures, they avoid them." Elena was already running contingency scenarios in her head. Aggressive wildlife at rescue sites meant modified approach protocols, possible need for deterrent measures, potential complications for victim extraction. But as she watched through the binoculars, none of the standard patterns applied. The wolves weren't exhibiting territorial aggression or feeding behavior. They were simply watching the helicopter, with alert attention, positioned around the cabin like sentries. "Take us down slow," she instructed Jake. "Wide circle first. I need to assess their behavior pattern before we commit to landing." As they descended in a careful spiral, Elena could see more details through her field glasses. The largest wolf, a magnificent female with silver-tipped fur, was positioned directly between the cabin and their approach vector. Her posture was alert but not aggressive, protective rather than threatening. The others maintained formation around the perimeter, but their ears were forward, curious rather than flattened in fear or anger. Then the cabin door opened, and Elena saw something that made her question everything she thought she knew about wildlife behavior. A young woman emerged from the building, moving with calm confidence toward the wolves. She showed no signs of fear, no indication that she considered herself in danger. Instead, she approached the silver female and placed a gentle hand on the wolf's head, speaking in soft tones that Elena couldn't hear over the helicopter noise. "My God," Jake breathed. "She's communicating with them." Elena watched in fascination as the woman gestured toward the helicopter, apparently explaining the situation to the wolves. The pack responded by slowly backing toward the tree line, but they didn't disappear entirely. They remained visible at the forest edge, maintaining visual contact with their human companion. The landing was surreal. Elena had expected to find a traumatized storm survivor, possibly injured, certainly grateful for rescue. Instead, she found Naya Rivers standing calmly beside the cabin, her clothes dry and her demeanor suggesting someone who had just concluded a pleasant social visit rather than survived a life-threatening emergency. "Are you injured?" Elena asked, running through her standard assessment checklist. "Any symptoms of hypothermia, frostbite, dehydration?" "I'm fine," Naya replied, though her attention kept drifting toward the tree line where the wolves waited. "Better than fine, actually. They kept me safe all night." Elena followed her gaze to the forest edge, where 6 pairs of eyes watched their every move. Professional protocol demanded that she establish a secure perimeter, ensure the victim was clear of wildlife threats before proceeding with evacuation. But these wolves weren't behaving like threats. They were behaving like concerned family members. "Tell me what happened," Elena said, activating her digital recorder. "Start from when you became separated from your research team." Naya's account was unlike anything Elena had encountered in hundreds of incident reports. No panic, no desperate fight for survival, no harrowing escape from predators. Instead, Naya described a night of unexpected companionship, of wolves that had chosen to protect rather than hunt, of communication that transcended species barriers. "They weren't just tolerating my presence," Naya explained, her voice carrying a note of wonder that Elena recognized from her own first encounters with the wilderness. "They actively guarded me when other predators approached during the night. The wolves positioned themselves as barriers. They shared warmth when the fire burned low. They listened when I talked to them." Elena had seen enough unusual animal behavior to know that stress and isolation could sometimes create false memories, could make people interpret normal wildlife patterns as personal connections. But the evidence before her eyes suggested something far beyond stress-induced imagination. "We need to get you back to base camp for medical evaluation," Elena said, though she was beginning to realize that standard procedures weren't going to apply to this situation. "Your research team is worried sick." As they prepared for evacuation, something remarkable happened. The silver female wolf stepped out of the forest, revealing herself fully at the clearing's edge. The other pack members followed, arranging themselves in a line among the trees. They weren't approaching or threatening. They were simply making their presence known. Elena realized they were saying goodbye. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary moment of Elena's career. Naya walked toward the wolves, stopping just beyond the tree line. The silver female approached to meet her, and the two beings, human and wolf, stood facing each other in perfect stillness. Then Naya reached out and placed both hands on the wolf's head, leaning forward to rest her forehead against the animal's. Elena found herself holding her breath as she witnessed this impossible farewell. Through her training and experience, she knew this should be dangerous, should be a situation requiring immediate intervention. But everything her professional instincts told her was contradicted by what she observed with her own eyes. The bond between Naya and these wolves was real, undeniable, and completely outside any behavioral framework Elena had ever studied. When Naya finally turned away and walked back to the helicopter, the silver female let out a sound that sent chills down Elena's spine. It wasn't a howl of triumph or territory. It was a sound of loss, of longing, of connections that transcended the boundaries between species. During the flight back to base camp, Elena found herself thinking about Marcus. Her ex-husband had always claimed that the relationships between humans and wildlife were more complex than her regulatory manual suggested. She had dismissed his photographer's romanticism as unscientific wishful thinking. But what she had witnessed today challenged every assumption she had made about the rigid boundaries between civilization and wilderness. "The wolves," Naya said through the headset, her voice barely audible over the rotors. "Will they be safe? Will someone try to relocate them or classify them as dangerous?" Elena looked back at her passenger, seeing in Naya's expression the same protective concern she had just witnessed from the wolf pack. The roles had reversed. Now the human was worried about her wild family's safety. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Elena replied, making a decision that went against standard wildlife management protocols. "As far as my report is concerned, you sheltered safely through the storm and experienced no aggressive wildlife encounters." But even as she said it, Elena knew that wouldn't be the end of the story. What had happened on Sentinel Ridge was too significant to remain a secret, too important to be buried in bureaucratic files. The bond between Naya and those wolves represented something unprecedented, something that could change fundamental assumptions about human-wildlife relationships. As they approached base camp, Elena was already planning her next move. She needed to contact Marcus, needed to share what she had witnessed with someone who might understand its significance. Her ex-husband's romantic notions about animal-human connections suddenly seemed less like wishful thinking and more like prophetic insight. The helicopter touched down to a crowd of relieved researchers and medical personnel. But Elena's mind was already racing ahead to the implications of what she had experienced. This rescue operation had become something far more significant than retrieving a lost botanist. It had become the first documented case of voluntary human adoption by a wild wolf pack, and Elena suspected it was only the beginning of something extraordinary. Thomas Blackwood had built the Wildwood Sanctuary from nothing more than a dream, and 30 acres of rugged Montana wilderness. After 20 years of veterinary practice in the city, he had grown tired of treating pampered pets while knowing that truly wild creatures struggled for survival without advocates. So he had taken his savings, bought land that nobody else wanted, and created a refuge for animals that existed in the gray area between wild and domestic. The sanctuary was home to wolves that couldn't be released, birds of prey recovering from injuries, and the occasional exotic animal rescued from illegal captivity. Thomas lived alone in a modest cabin on the property, finding more satisfaction in the company of creatures that communicated through action rather than words. At 45, he had convinced himself that solitude was a choice rather than a circumstance, that his work was companion enough for any man. That conviction lasted until the morning Elena Winters called him about a botanist named Nia Rivers. Thomas knew Elena by reputation. She was the park ranger who had revolutionized wildlife management protocols in Alaska, the one who insisted that animals were individuals rather than statistics. When she described what had happened on Sentinel Ridge, Thomas listened with the skeptical attention of someone who had heard too many exaggerated rescue stories. "I've never seen anything like it, Thomas," Elena said through the satellite phone connection. "This woman didn't just survive an encounter with wolves, she became part of their pack. I watched them say goodbye to her like she was family." Thomas set down his morning coffee and looked out across his sanctuary grounds, where a pair of recovering timber wolves were playing in their enclosure. The idea of truly wild wolves accepting a human as pack seemed impossible, but Elena wasn't given to flights of fancy. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said, though he suspected he already knew. "She can't go back to her old life," Elena replied, "not after experiencing something like this. And from what Marcus tells me, those wolves haven't forgotten her either. They've been tracking in the direction of human settlements, looking for their lost pack member." The files arrived by courier 3 days later, along with something Thomas hadn't expected. A personal letter from Nia Rivers herself. Her handwriting was careful and precise, the words of someone accustomed to scientific documentation, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. "I know how this must sound," she wrote. "I know the scientific community will have explanations for what happened that make it seem less extraordinary than it felt. But I experienced something on that mountain that changed my understanding of what connection means. Those wolves chose to protect me, and I chose to trust them. That bond doesn't disappear just because we're separated by distance." Thomas found himself reading the letter twice, then a third time. There was something in Nia's words that resonated with his own experience of finding purpose outside conventional expectations. She was describing the same sense of belonging that he had found among his rescued animals. The photographs Marcus had taken were extraordinary. Image after image of wolves actively protecting a human, of natural predators choosing cooperation over competition. But it was the final photo that convinced Thomas completely. Nia and the silver female wolf, foreheads touching in a gesture of farewell that spoke of genuine affection. "Bring them here," he told Elena when he called back. "Nia and the wolves. I'll file the necessary permits for a controlled reintroduction program. We'll call it research into human-wolf bonding." The logistics were complicated, but Thomas had spent 2 decades navigating wildlife regulations, and Elena's connections opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Marcus documented every step, creating a photographic record of what he called the first scientifically observed cross-species family reunion. Nia arrived at Wildwood Sanctuary on a crisp autumn morning, her nervousness evident in the way she kept checking the tree line. Thomas watched from his cabin porch as the transport truck arrived, carrying the most unusual family he had ever attempted to house. "They might not remember me," Nia said as the truck doors opened, doubt creeping into her voice for the first time. "It's been 3 months." 6 wolves emerged into the sanctuary's main enclosure, heads raised to test the wind. Then the silver female caught a familiar scent and let out a sound that was part howl, part cry of joy. What followed was a reunion that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. The wolves surrounded Naya in a whirlwind of fur and affection, tails wagging, bodies pressing close, vocalizations that spoke of relief and happiness. Luna pushed her great head against Naya's chest while the younger wolves danced around them, creating a circle of celebration. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself drawn into the daily rhythms of pack life. Naya had accepted his offer to stay as lead researcher, though he suspected the real reason was that she couldn't bear separation from her wolves again. Working alongside her was a revelation. Naya understood animal behavior in ways that transcended academic training, reading emotional states with an intuition that complemented his medical expertise perfectly. But it was the quiet moments that surprised him most, evenings when they would sit on the cabin porch, watching the wolves settle into twilight routines. "I never thought I was the type for this kind of life," Naya confessed one evening as Luna dozed at her feet. "Before the storm, I was focused on career, publications, climbing the academic ladder. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else." Thomas looked at her profile in the fading light, noting the contentment in her expression as she watched the wolves play. Somewhere along the way, without him quite noticing, Naya had become essential to his vision of what the sanctuary could be. "I never thought I was the type for companionship," he admitted. "After years of focusing entirely on work, I convinced myself solitude was enough. But watching you with your pack, seeing what connection actually looks like, it's made me realize what I've been missing." Instead of answering with words, Thomas reached for her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. Luna raised her great head to observe this development, her amber eyes seeming to approve of this expansion of pack bonds. 6 months later, Thomas and Naya's wedding took place in the sanctuary's main meadow, with Luna serving as unofficial maid of honor and the entire wolf pack forming a circle round the ceremony. As he kissed his bride while surrounded by wolves who had chosen to make humans part of their pack, Thomas realized that family wasn't about biology or convention. It was about choice, loyalty, and the courage to love across boundaries others considered impossible to cross.